If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. The morning sunlight of New York City penetrated through the silk curtains of Isabella's room, illuminating her young face as she sat at the antique dressing table, observing her reflection with a mixture of melancholy and resignation. Her delicate fingers glided distractedly over the piano keys that she never wanted to learn to play, but which was part of the rigorous protocol of her privileged education. On that specific morning, something was different. The air seemed heavier, as if carrying the premonition of an inevitable change. Isabella adjusted the light blue satin dress that her mother had chosen especially for that occasion, an apparently ordinary lunch with an important family friend. "Isabella, your father, is calling. Major Ethan Crawford has just arrived," announced Martha, the housekeeper, with a tone that mixed formality and a poorly disguised hint of compassion. The name caused an involuntary shiver down her spine. Major Ethan Crawford. At 20, Isabella had heard enough stories about that man to know that his presence inspired more fear than respect in military circles. A man known for his iron discipline and icy gaze, which seemed to pierce the soul of anyone who dared to look him in the eye. Descending the mansion stairs with the grace that years of etiquette classes had bestowed upon her, Isabella tried to control the tremor that threatened to betray her nervousness. In the spacious living room, her father, Richard Montgomery, an influential businessman from New York City, was conversing in a low tone with a tall man in an impeccable military posture, in uniform. "Ah, darling, come closer," her father called, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Major Crawford, this is my daughter, Isabella." The major turned slowly, his eyes, a deep brown, almost black, fixed on Isabella with disconcerting intensity. There was no warmth in that gaze, only a meticulous analysis, as if he were evaluating an object on display. "Miss Montgomery," he greeted, with a deep and controlled voice, making a small bow that seemed more like a mechanical movement than a gesture of courtesy. Lunch proceeded in a dense atmosphere. Isabella barely touched her food, while discreetly observing the exchange of meaningful glances between her father and the major. Something was being plotted there. She could feel it. The conversation revolved around business, politics, and the current security situation in New York City, topics that would not normally be part of a lunch where she would be present. It was only after dessert that the true reason for that meeting came to light. Her father cleared his throat, adjusting himself in his chair with that posture that Isabella knew well, the posture he assumed when he was about to give an irrevocable verdict. "Isabella, you are already an adult woman and were raised to understand the importance of family alliances," he began, his words falling like stones in the silence of the environment. "Major Crawford and I have reached an agreement that will benefit both families." Isabella's heart accelerated. She knew well the meaning of those words. How many of her friends had not gone through the same situation? Arranged marriages were common in her social circle, but she always believed that her father, who spoiled her so much, would never subject her to such a fate. "The wedding will be held in 3 weeks," her father continued, as if he were discussing the purchase of a new property. "All the details have already been arranged." Isabella felt the air escape from her lungs. 3 weeks. She didn't even have the chance to protest, to argue, to beg for more time. The major remained impassive, as if the future wife's reaction was completely irrelevant to his plans. "There is also the matter of my sister," the major spoke for the first time since the announcement. "As part of the agreement, we need to ensure that her guardianship remains under my responsibility. Your father kindly offered his support in this matter." So that was it. A commercial agreement, an exchange of favors. Isabella was just another piece in that social chess game, strategically moved to ensure alliances and protect interests. Her heart, her dreams, her desires, none of that mattered in the face of the plans laid out by those powerful men. That night, alone in her room, Isabella allowed herself to cry for the first time. The silent tears wet her pillow as she tried to process the turnaround her life had taken in a matter of hours. In 3 weeks, she would cease to be Isabella Montgomery to become Mrs. Crawford, wife of a man she barely knew and who already frightened her with his calculated coldness. The 3 weeks leading up to the wedding passed like a confused blur in Isabella's mind. Between dress fittings, choice of flowers, and endless rehearsals of the ceremony, she felt increasingly distant from her own reality, as if watching the preparation of someone else's wedding. Major Ethan Crawford would appear occasionally for formal family meetings, always maintaining a calculated distance from his bride. Their encounters were supervised and brief, filled with superficial conversations about the weather or about the wedding preparations. At no time did he show any interest in truly getting to know her or in sharing anything about himself. On the eve of the wedding, during the rehearsal dinner, Isabella discreetly observed her future husband interacting with his younger sister, Emily. It was the only moment when she noticed a subtle change in his always severe expression. There was a glimmer of protection there, perhaps even tenderness, that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Emily, a 15-year-old teenager, seemed to be the only person capable of provoking any human reaction in that man who seemed to be made of ice. "You'll like our house," said Emily, approaching Isabella during dessert. "It's big and quiet, but it has a wonderful garden. I used to play there when I was younger, before everything changed." There was something in Emily's unspoken words that aroused Isabella's curiosity. What changes would those be? What could have happened for the Major to assume the guardianship of his sister? But before she could ask any questions, the Major appeared beside them, his imposing presence silencing any attempt at confidence. The wedding day dawned with a peculiarly grey sky for a spring day in New York City. Isabella observed through the window of her room while the seamstresses made the final adjustments to her wedding dress. The traditional model, with delicate lace and an impressive train, had been chosen by her mother and approved by the Major, yet another decision over which she had no say. "You look beautiful, my daughter," said her mother, entering the room with teary eyes. "I know it's not the wedding of your dreams, but trust your father. He has always known what's best for you." Isabella wanted to scream, wanted to say that no, her father didn't know what was best for her. How could he know, if he never asked what she wanted? But the words died in her throat, suffocated by years of conditioning to be the perfect, obedient and resigned daughter. The ceremony was held at St. Patrick's Cathedral, one of the most prestigious landmarks of New York City. The city's elite attended in full force, more interested in the social spectacle than in the sacrament being celebrated. Isabella walked to the altar like an automaton, her body moving by pure reflex while her mind wandered far from there. The Major waited for her at the altar, his impeccable uniform decorated with medals that told stories of bravery and discipline. His face remained impassive, as if he were on another military mission to be accomplished with precision and efficiency. During the exchange of vows, Isabella felt an almost imperceptible tremor in the Major's hands as he placed the ring on her finger. It was so subtle that she questioned whether she had imagined it, a desperate attempt by her heart to find some sign of humanity in that man who was now her husband. The reception took place in the gardens of the Plaza Hotel, and even there, surrounded by luxury and music, Isabella felt completely alone. She danced the first waltz with the Major, their bodies maintaining a protocol distance as they spun around the ballroom under the watchful eyes of the guests. "We will depart in an hour," he informed, his voice low and controlled. "Martha has already prepared your bags. Emily awaits us at home." Home. The word sounded strange to Isabella's ears. What kind of home would that be, built on foundations of convenience and obligation? What would it be like to share her life with a man who seemed incapable of showing any emotion? The Crawford mansion stood imposingly in one of the most upscale neighborhoods of New York City, a modern construction, all glass and concrete, which looked more like a fortress than a home. When the car parked at the entrance, Isabella felt a tightness in her chest. The huge windows reflected the last lights of the day, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. Emily was the first to receive them, running to hug her brother with an intimacy that contrasted with all the previous coldness. "Finally, you're here." "I was getting bored alone," she said, before turning to Isabella with a hesitant smile. "Come, I'll show you your room. I mean, your bedroom." The Major intervened before Emily could continue. "I will show the facilities to my wife myself. Emily, please ask Mary to serve dinner in an hour." His voice did not admit contestation, and Emily nodded, casting an apologetic look at Isabella before disappearing toward the kitchen. The tour of the house was methodical and impersonal, as if the Major were presenting military facilities. "This is the main hall, used only for formal events. The library is to the right. Feel free to use the books as long as you keep them organized. The music room is equipped with a piano should you wish to practice." Each room was an example of obsessive organization. There wasn't a cushion out of place, no object that suggested real people lived there. The walls, in shades of grey and white, displayed no family photographs, only some carefully selected abstract paintings. "The office," he said, stopping in front of a massive wooden door, "is exclusively for my use. It remains locked when I am absent." His eyes met Isabella's with a disturbing intensity. "This is a non-negotiable rule." Isabella nodded, swallowing hard. The mystery of that locked door was already beginning to stir her curiosity, but she knew that now was not the time to question. The Major continued the tour, climbing the main staircase with precise steps. "Our room is at the end of the corridor," he announced, opening the door to a surprisingly spacious environment. The decoration followed the same minimalist pattern as the rest of the house, but there was something different there. A small armchair near the window, with a delicate shawl thrown over the backrest. "Emily chose some details to make the environment more welcoming," explained the Major, appearing almost embarrassed. It was the first time Isabella noticed a breach in his armor of formality. The suite bathroom was equally impressive, with an antique bathtub that stood out from the modern style of the house. "It was my mother's," he commented, surprising Isabella with the voluntary information. "Emily insisted on keeping it when we renovated the house." A heavy silence settled between them. Isabella realized that this was the first time they were truly alone, without the presence of family members or employees. The Major seemed equally aware of this fact, as his posture became even more rigid. "I will leave you to settle in," he said, heading for the door. "Dinner will be served in 40 minutes. Emily usually dresses formally for meals. It's a family tradition that I maintain for her." As soon as the door closed, Isabella allowed herself to relax a little. She walked to the window, observing the well-maintained gardens that extended to the high walls of the property. A movement caught her attention. Emily, sitting on a stone bench, appeared absorbed in a book. The scene provoked an involuntary smile from Isabella. Perhaps that teenager was the key to understanding the enigma that was Major Ethan Crawford. There was something in the way he softened in his sister's presence that suggested a depth of feelings that he strived to hide. The sound of a discreet bell announced that it was time to prepare for dinner. Isabella opened one of the suitcases that Martha had packed, finding a navy blue dress that she considered appropriate for the occasion. As she got ready, her mind was working, processing each observed detail. The house, despite its apparent coldness, held small signs of life. The shawl on the armchair, the antique bathtub, the bench in the garden where Emily read. They were like chinks of light in a fortress of ice, suggesting that perhaps beneath all that rigidity and control, there was a deeper story to be discovered. The reflection in the mirror showed a different Isabella from the girl who had left her parents' house a few hours earlier. Her eyes, always dreamy, now carried a gleam of determination. If this was the fate that had been imposed on her, she would find a way to transform it into something more than a mere agreement between families. The key first dinner at the Crawford mansion set the tone for what would be the following weeks. The table, perfectly arranged for 3 people, seemed too large in the austere environment of the dining room. Emily, wearing a dark green dress that made her look older than her 15 years, occupied her place to the right of her brother, while Isabella sat to the left. "Meals are served punctually at 7 in the evening," explained the Major, while Mary, the housekeeper, served the appetizer. "Breakfast at 6 and lunch at noon. When I am at home, I expect everyone to be present." Isabella noticed how Emily automatically straightened her posture upon hearing her brother's voice. It was as if an invisible command had been activated, transforming the vivacious teenager she had seen in the garden into a miniature version of the military rigidity that dominated the house. "And when you're not at home?" Isabella dared to ask, breaking the protocol of silence that seemed to reign. "During meals." The Major raised his eyes from his plate, his penetrating gaze meeting hers. "My absences are frequent and not always predictable. On those occasions, Mary supervises the routine of the house and Emily. Now, naturally, you will also have that responsibility." The word responsibility hung in the air. It was not a request for care or companionship, but a veiled order. Isabella realized that her role there went beyond being just a wife. She would be one more guardian of the order established by the Major. After dinner, Emily surprised everyone by sitting at the piano. Her fingers glided over the keys with a skill that Isabella instantly envied, producing the melancholic notes of a Beethoven sonata. "Our mother taught her," said the Major in a low voice, almost a whisper, upon noticing Isabella's admiring look. "Emily has a natural gift for music." It was the first time he had mentioned his mother directly, and Isabella noticed how his eyes, normally cold, gained a different shine as he observed his sister playing. For a fleeting moment, the mask of severity gave way to something deeper, more human. The days began to establish their own rhythm. The Major left early and frequently returned late. Sometimes he spent days away on unspecified missions. During these moments, the house seemed to breathe differently, as if the furniture itself relaxed its rigid posture. It was during one of these absences that Emily began to get closer to Isabella. The two developed the habit of having tea together, in the garden, on afternoons when Emily didn't have private lessons. The teenager gradually revealed fragments of the family history, always careful not to say more than she should. "Ethan wasn't always like this," Emily confided during one of these afternoons, her voice low as if the walls could hear. "He changed after serving overseas. He came back different, more closed off, and then when our parents, well, he had to take over everything alone." Isabella absorbed each word like a precious clue to the puzzle that was her husband. The mention of service overseas and the subsequent change in the Major's behavior lit a light in her mind. There was trauma there, buried under layers and layers of discipline and control. One morning, while organizing her things in the conjugal closet, Isabella found a box of military medals. She didn't dare open it, but noticed how it was carefully positioned, as if it were a private altar of memories that the Major preferred to keep closed. At night, when he returned from one of his missions, Isabella noticed something different in his behavior. There was an additional tension in his shoulders, an almost imperceptible tremor in his hands as he held the cutlery during dinner. His eyes, normally focused and alert, seemed lost in distant memories. "Are you all right, Major?" she asked, breaking the protocol silence of the meal. He stared at her for a moment, as if surprised by the question. "I am perfectly fine," he responded with his usual coldness, but Isabella noticed how his fingers gripped the napkin more tightly. That night, for the first time since the wedding, the Major did not immediately retire to his office after dinner. Instead, he remained in the music room, listening to Emily play. Isabella, sitting discreetly in a corner, observed how the music seemed to have a calming effect on him, softening the hard lines of his expression. The routine at the Crawford mansion had established itself like a silent dance, where each participant knew their steps with millimetric precision. However, it was on a particularly hot summer afternoon that this rehearsed choreography began to show its first flaws. Isabella was helping Emily with her literature studies when Mary, the housekeeper, entered the library hurriedly. Her normally composed face showed unusual agitation. "Mrs. Crawford," she said, her hands nervously twisting her apron, "there is an urgent call for the Major, but I cannot contact him at any of the numbers he left." Emily immediately raised her head, her eyes revealing a concern that went beyond the immediate situation. "It must be from command," she murmured, more to herself than to the others. "The office," Isabella suddenly said. "He must have left some emergency number there." The words left her mouth before she could think about the implications. The office was forbidden territory, the only rule that the Major had established with absolute clarity. "But it's locked," responded Mary hesitantly, and the Major never left a copy of the key. It was then that Emily stood up, a sudden determination on her young face. "I know where he keeps the spare key," she announced, surprising both Isabella and Mary. "He doesn't know that I know, but once I saw him hiding it behind the antique clock in the hallway." The silence that followed this revelation was laden with tension. Isabella knew they were on the verge of crossing an important line. Violating the Major's office wasn't just breaking a rule, it was invading the last redoubt of his privacy. "Emily, are you sure?" asked Isabella, feeling the weight of responsibility in her words. The teenager nodded, already heading to the hallway. With a skill that suggested previous practice, she moved the heavy clock a few centimeters and felt behind it, removing a small golden key. The office, when finally opened, revealed itself to be surprisingly different from the rest of the house. Instead of the military organization that reigned in the other rooms, there was a kind of controlled chaos. Maps covered one of the walls, marked with points and incomprehensible annotations. On the mahogany desk, folders and documents formed precise piles, each labeled with dates and codes. But it was a framed photograph, half hidden behind some books, that captured Isabella's attention. In it, a much younger Ethan smiled openly, wearing civilian clothes, next to a woman of delicate appearance who held a baby, Emily, presumably. It was the first time Isabella saw a genuine smile on her husband's face, even if it was only in an old photograph. "That's our mother," said Emily softly, approaching the photo. "It was taken a few weeks before the accident." Before Isabella could ask more, Mary found a phone book in the top drawer of the desk. "Here it is," she announced, quickly flipping through the pages. The emergency number for command. While Mary hurriedly left to make the call, Isabella couldn't take her eyes off the photograph. There was something deeply revealing in that image, not just about who the Major had been, but about who he could still be. "He never got over it," continued Emily, her voice almost a whisper. "The accident, I mean. He was on a mission when it happened, couldn't get there in time. After that, he swore he would never leave anything out of control in his life again." Isabella felt her heart tighten. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. The obsession with order, the rigid control, the emotional detachment. They weren't just personality traits, they were scars from a deep trauma. A noise in the hallway made them both freeze. Quickly, Emily put the photograph back in its place, while Isabella organized the papers exactly as they had found them. In seconds, they were out of the office, locking the door and returning the key to its hiding place. That night, during dinner, the Major seemed more taciturn than normal. His eyes occasionally rested on Isabella with a different intensity, as if looking for something in her expression. She maintained her composure, but inside her heart was beating rapidly. She had discovered more about her husband in 1 hour, inside that office, than in all the weeks since their wedding. The weight of the shared secret created a new dynamic between Isabella and Emily. In the days that followed, the two developed a silent complicity, exchanging meaningful glances during meals, especially when the Major was more taciturn than usual. One morning, while having coffee in the garden, taking advantage of a rare absence of the Major, Emily finally decided to reveal more about her family past. "Mom loved this garden," she began, her fingers playing distractedly with the edge of the cup. "She spent hours here tending to the roses. Ethan had them all pulled out after she was gone, said he needed a more practical, more organized garden. But he couldn't change everything. That stone bench where I usually read, he tried to remove it 3 times. Something always happened that prevented it." Isabella observed the solitary bench, noticing for the first time how it stood out from the minimalist design of the rest of the garden. It was almost as if it were an involuntary monument, a last resistance against the emotional sterility that dominated the property. "You know," continued Emily, her voice taking on a more confidential tone, "sometimes I hear him at night when he thinks I'm sleeping. He goes to the office and stays there for hours. Once, he spent the entire night in there. The next day, his eyes were red, as if—" The phrase was left hanging in the air, interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Mary appeared in the garden, her face tense. "Mrs. Crawford, there is a call for Miss Emily." It's from the school. The phone call proved to be more significant than it appeared. Emily had been selected to represent her school in an international piano competition in Vienna, an exceptional honor that would require her absence for 2 weeks. The problem was that the regulations required the presence of a legal guardian throughout the competition. "He will never allow it," said Emily after hanging up the phone. Her eyes, previously bright with excitement, were now clouded with resignation. "Ethan can't stand the idea of seeing me away from him for so long, since our parents. Well, you know." Isabella felt a determination growing inside her. It was the first time she had seen a true passion in Emily's eyes, something beyond the resigned obedience that characterized her usual behavior. "I will talk to him," declared Isabella, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. The opportunity arose that same night. The Major had returned earlier than usual, and after dinner, against all his habits, accepted Isabella's invitation for coffee on the veranda. "Emily told me about the competition in Vienna," she began, carefully observing her husband's reaction. His jaw visibly tensed. "I have already informed the school that she will not participate." "Without even consulting your sister?" The question came out more incisive than Isabella had planned, but she maintained her firm gaze. "There is nothing to consult. My decision is final." His tone was definitive, but Isabella perceived something else in his voice, fear perhaps. "Major," she said, softening her voice, "I saw the photograph in your office." The silence that followed was deafening, his eyes, normally cold and distant, fixed on hers with a disturbing intensity. "You entered my office." His voice was low, controlled, but loaded with a palpable tension. "It was an emergency," she responded, maintaining her calm. "But that's not what I want to talk about. I saw how your mother held Emily in her arms, saw your smile in the photo. She was a pianist, wasn't she?" The Major rose abruptly, his hands gripping the back of the chair tightly. For a moment, Isabella thought he would simply leave, ending the conversation as he usually did when the subject became too personal. But to her surprise, he remained there, his gaze lost in the darkness of the garden. "She gave piano lessons," he finally said, his voice almost a whisper. "Emily inherited her talent. And her smile." A long pause followed, laden with unspoken memories. "But the world is too dangerous for smiles." "The world will always be dangerous," responded Isabella softly, risking lightly touching his arm. "But we cannot let fear prevent us from living. Your sister has a gift, Major, a gift that your mother recognized and encouraged. Don't you think she would like to see Emily following in her footsteps?" The piano remained silent in the days that followed the conversation on the veranda. Emily, although maintaining her usual routine, carried with her a silent sadness that was almost palpable. Her hands, normally so agile over the keys, now remained quiet in her lap during meals like caged birds. Isabella observed this change with growing concern, but also noticed something different in the Major's behavior. He spent more time in his office than usual, and sometimes, late at night, one could hear the sound of drawers being opened and closed, papers being handled. It was on one of these nights that Isabella, unable to sleep, decided to go down to the kitchen to make some tea. On the way, she noticed a faint light coming from the office, whose door was ajar, something completely out of the ordinary. Approaching silently, she saw the Major sitting in his armchair, an old album of photographs open on his lap. "You can come in," he said without raising his eyes from the album. His voice did not carry the usual military coldness, sounding almost tired. Isabella entered hesitantly, observing how the lamplight created dancing shadows on the walls covered with maps and decorations. The Major closed the album delicately, but did not put it away. "My mother," he began, his voice low but clear, "gave her first recital at 16 in Vienna." He paused, his fingers caressing the cover of the album. "She was younger than Emily is now." Isabella remained silent, feeling that that moment was too precious to be interrupted. The Major stood up, heading to a cabinet in the corner of the room. From inside it, he removed an old folder yellowed by time. "These are her sheet music," he said, opening the folder with almost reverential care. "Some have annotations in German. She studied at the Vienna Conservatory for 3 years. The yellowed pages revealed not only musical notes, but also small comments in the margins, written in a delicate handwriting. Isabella noticed how the Major's eyes softened as he passed his fingers over those annotations. "Emily has the same way of playing as her," he continued, his voice carrying an emotion that Isabella had never perceived before. "The same head movement, the same way of closing her eyes in the most difficult passages." A heavy silence fell over the office. Isabella could feel that there was more, much more, that the Major wanted to say. Years of repressed emotions seemed to be fighting to find a way out. "On the day of the accident," he finally continued, his voice almost a whisper, "I was on a mission overseas. She had an important recital, had promised Emily she would be there. It was raining." His voice faltered slightly. "The car skidded on a curve. When I received the news, I was thousands of miles away." Isabella felt her heart tighten. The guilt he carried was almost tangible, as heavy as the medals on his uniform. "After that, I swore I would never leave Emily unprotected again. That I would never be far away when she needed me." He closed the folder of sheet music carefully. "But perhaps I have confused protection with imprisonment." The Major stood up, walking to the window. The moonlight illuminated his profile, revealing lines of worry that Isabella had never noticed before. "Vienna," he said, after a long moment of silence. "The competition is in 3 weeks." Isabella nodded, her heart accelerating with the possibility that was opening up. "Yes, and she would need a guardian." "You could accompany her," he interrupted, turning to face her. "I have contacts at the embassy. I can ensure you have all the necessary protection. And Emily..." He hesitated for a moment. "Emily needs this opportunity, needs to fly with her own wings like her mother did." The surprise on Isabella's face must have been evident, for a slight smile, the first she had ever seen in person, appeared at the corner of the Major's lips. "Sometimes," he said, sitting back down, "we need someone to show us that our greatest fortresses can become our worst prisons." His eyes met Isabella's with a different intensity. "Thank you for having that courage." The news of Emily's participation in the competition in Vienna completely transformed the atmosphere of the Crawford mansion. The piano, previously silent, came back to life with the intense rehearsals of the young pianist. Emily practiced for hours, her hands dancing over the keys with renewed dedication, while Isabella observed her, marveling at the change in her posture. The preparations for the trip revealed a side of the Major that surprised everyone. He personally supervised each detail, from booking the best seats on the plane to choosing the hotel in Vienna, always consulting old notes in his files about the city that his mother had loved so much. "This is the address of the old conservatory," he said one night, showing Emily an old map of Vienna he had found in his research. "Your grandmother used to practice in the rooms on the 3rd floor. She said they had the best acoustics in the city." Emily absorbed each piece of information with bright eyes, as if each detail about the grandmother she had never known was a precious treasure. Isabella noticed how the Major gradually began to share more memories, as if the ice that imprisoned his heart was slowly melting. Mary, the housekeeper, also participated in the preparations in her own way. One day, Isabella found her in the attic rummaging through old boxes. "You need to see this," said Mary, carefully removing a vintage gala dress from one of the boxes. It belonged to Mrs. Helena, the Major's mother. She wore this dress in her last recital in Vienna before returning to the United States. The dress, an elegant model in shades of midnight blue, seemed to have been preserved with all the care in the world. Mary held it as if it were a sacred relic, and in a way it was. "Emily has exactly the same build as her grandmother," commented Mary, her eyes misty. Maybe she could wear it in her presentation." The suggestion was carefully brought to the Major. To everyone's surprise, he not only approved the idea, but also brought from his office a small velvet box that held a set of pearl earrings. "They were hers too," he said, handing the box to Emily with slightly trembling hands. "She always said pearls brought good luck at performances." The rehearsals intensified in the weeks leading up to the trip. Emily spent hours at the piano, perfecting each note, each movement. The Major, contrary to all his habits, began to have dinner earlier to be able to attend his sister's evening rehearsals. On one of these nights, Isabella found him alone in the music room long after Emily had retired. He was sitting at the piano, his fingers resting on the keys without pressing them, as if trying to capture something invisible in the air. "She used to play for me every night," he said without turning around, "even when I was a teenager and pretended not to care. She said music had the power to soften the hardest edges of life." Isabella approached silently, sitting beside him on the piano bench. It was the first time they had been so physically close since the wedding. "You're afraid," she said softly, not as a question but as a statement. The Major remained silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the black and white keys in front of him. "I'm afraid of losing control," he finally admitted. "Of not being there if something happens, of failing again." "Sometimes," Isabella responded, daring to place her hand on his, "the greatest act of love is trust. Trust that we've taught enough, that we've given strong enough foundations for them to fly on their own." The Major turned his hand, intertwining his fingers with hers in a surprisingly intimate gesture. "Promise you'll take care of her," he said, his voice laden with contained emotion. "I promise," responded Isabella, feeling the warmth of his hand against hers. "But you promise something too, that you'll try to trust not only in me but in yourself, in the love you have for her, which is greater than any fear." New York International Airport was busy that Thursday morning. Emily, wearing an elegant outfit chosen especially for the trip, firmly held the strap of her bag, where she kept the sheet music. Isabella walked beside her, alternating her attention between the young pianist and the Major, who followed them with measured steps and a contained expression. The farewell would be at the boarding gate. Throughout the journey there, the Major maintained his military posture, but his eyes betrayed an emotion that he struggled to control. When the moment to say goodbye finally arrived, something unexpected happened. "Wait," he said, removing an aged envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket. "Emily, this belonged to your grandmother. She wrote this letter before her last performance in Vienna. I want you to read it only when you're there, before the competition." Emily received the envelope with trembling hands, her teary eyes fixed on her brother. Without warning, she threw herself into his arms, breaking all the protocols of behavior that had governed their relationship for years. To everyone's surprise, including his own, the Major not only accepted the hug but returned it, embracing his sister in a protective gesture that seemed to contain years of repressed affection. "I'll make you proud," whispered Emily, her voice choked with emotion. "We already are," he responded, his voice hoarse. Then, turning to Isabella, he added, "Take care of her and of yourself too." The moment was interrupted by the boarding announcement. Emily reluctantly disentangled herself from her brother's embrace, discreetly wiping away tears. Isabella approached the Major for a formal farewell, but he surprised her by holding her hand and placing a small object in it. "The key to the office," he explained, at her questioning look. "For when you return, there is much more about our family that you need to know." During the flight, Emily alternated between studying her sheet music and admiring the view of the clouds through the window, her eyes shining with a mixture of expectation and nervousness. Isabella observed the change in the young girl. It was as if each mile they distanced themselves from New York transformed her a little more, freeing her from the invisible shackles that bound her. "You know," said Emily after a few hours of flight, "this is the first time I've traveled without Ethan having planned every minute of my day. It's scary, but at the same time." She paused, searching for the right words. "It's like I can finally breathe fully." Isabella smiled, understanding the feeling perfectly. "Sometimes we need to distance ourselves to see more clearly," she responded. "Your brother is learning that too, even if slowly." When they finally landed in Vienna, the city welcomed them, with a soft drizzle that seemed to sprinkle the historic buildings with silver. The hotel chosen by the Major was in the heart of the music district, just a few blocks from the conservatory where his mother had studied. In the room, while unpacking, Emily finally found the courage to open the envelope her brother had given her. The letter, written in an elegant handwriting, began with words that filled her eyes with tears. My dear Emily, when you read this letter, you will be about to make your debut in Vienna, the city that shaped my life and, I hope, will shape yours as well. I know we never met in person, but through music our hearts will always be connected. Emily couldn't continue reading, her hands trembling too much. Isabella sat beside her on the bed, offering silent support as the young girl processed the emotion of the moment. She knew, whispered Emily, pressing the letter against her chest. Somehow she knew I would follow in her footsteps. How is that possible? Love has a mysterious way of transcending time, responded Isabella softly. Your grandmother planted a musical seed in your family, and that seed has blossomed in you. That night on the other side of the ocean, Major Ethan Crawford sat alone in his office, an untouched glass of whiskey on the desk. His eyes were fixed on the photograph of his mother at the piano, and for the first time in many years, he allowed himself to truly smile at the thought of the legacy she had left, a legacy that he was finally allowing to flourish through Emily. The first week in Vienna unfolded in a whirlwind of emotions and discoveries. Emily divided her time between intensive rehearsals for the competition and explorations of the city her grandmother had loved so much. Each street, each historic cafe, each concert hall seemed to hold echoes of a past that was gradually revealing itself. The conservatory in particular became a special place. Through the Major's contacts, they obtained permission for Emily to practice in the same rooms where her grandmother had studied decades ago. The perfect acoustics of the place seemed to awaken something new in her music. It's like I can feel her here, said Emily one afternoon, after a particularly intense rehearsal. Sometimes, when I'm playing, it's almost as if her hands were guiding mine. Over the keys, Isabella, who attended the rehearsals with dedication, noticed the subtle changes in Emily's way of playing. There was a maturity emerging in her interpretation, a depth that went beyond impeccable technique. An unexpected discovery occurred during a visit to the conservatory's historical archive. Among old performance records, they found a recital program with the name Helena Crawford, accompanied by a music critic from the time who described her as an American revelation who brings with her not only exemplary technique, but a soul that transcends the written notes. Just like you, commented Isabella, observing how Emily read and reread the critique with teary eyes. The competition was rapidly approaching. On the eve of the first elimination round, Emily finally found the courage to finish reading her grandmother's letter. Sitting on the small balcony of the hotel, with the night view of Vienna in the background, her voice trembled as she read aloud to Isabella. Music, my dear, is not just about technical perfection. It's about allowing our soul to dance through the notes. When you step onto that stage, don't think about pleasing the judges or making your brother proud. Think only about letting your heart speak through your fingers. That's how we transform notes into magic. That night, Isabella was surprised to receive a call from the Major. His voice, normally so controlled, carried a note of poorly disguised anxiety. "How is she?" he asked after the formal greetings. "Nervous but prepared," responded Isabella. "She has found much more than music here, Major. She has found a connection to her roots." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "I should be there," he finally said, his voice low. "You still can come," suggested Isabella gently. "The final is in 4 days. I'm sure Emily would love to have you in the audience." Another silence, longer this time. "There's an important mission scheduled," he began, but his voice was losing strength. "Major," interrupted Isabella, gathering all her courage, "your mother missed Emily's performance due to circumstances beyond her control. You have the chance to do differently, to break this cycle of absences." The words seemed to hit him hard. When he spoke again, his voice had a different tone, more determined. "I'll see what I can do." The next morning, while helping Emily prepare for her first performance, Isabella kept to herself the hope of seeing the Major in the audience days later. The young pianist was already nervous enough without adding that expectation. Her grandmother's midnight blue dress had been perfectly adjusted to Emily's body, and the pearls shone softly in her ears. When she looked in the mirror, it wasn't just her reflection she saw. It was the echo of generations of strong women who had left their mark through music. "Ready?" asked Isabella, adjusting Emily's elegant bun one last time. The young girl took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on her. Reflection. "You know," she said with a small smile, "I think I finally understood what Grandma meant in her letter. It's not about being perfect. It's about being true." Emily's performance in the semi-final was received with a standing ovation. Her interpretation of the Moonlight Sonata had touched something deep in the audience, and the judges' comments were unanimous in praising not only her technique, but mainly her ability to convey emotion through music. "It's impressive," commented one of the judges after the announcement of her qualification for the final, "how someone so young can understand so well the emotional layers of this piece." Madame Sophia, who had remained silent during the comments, finally spoke. "She doesn't just understand the music, she lives it, exactly as her grandmother did." Back at the hotel, while celebrating the qualification with a special dinner at the restaurant, Isabella received a discreet message on her cell phone. It was from the Major, confirming his arrival in Vienna the next morning. "Please don't tell Emily yet, I don't want to make her nervous before the final." Isabella smiled to herself, observing Emily, who, at that moment, was animatedly describing to Madame Sophia her ideas for the final presentation. Her brother's presence would be a surprise that could change everything. The next morning, while Emily was busy with her final rehearsal at the conservatory, Isabella headed to the airport. The Major, when he finally emerged from the arrival gate, seemed different. His features, although still maintaining their characteristic seriousness, were softer, and he carried with him an old folder that Isabella recognized from the office. "How is she?" was his first question after the formal greetings. "Transformed," responded Isabella honestly. "Vienna has awakened something in her that was dormant, something that goes beyond music." On the way to the hotel, the Major remained silent, his eyes absorbing every detail of the city that had meant so much to his mother. Occasionally his hand caressed the folder he had brought, as if seeking courage in its contents. "We found Madame Sophia," commented Isabella, breaking the silence. "She has been an incredible mentor for Emily." The Major turned abruptly in her direction, surprise evident on his face. "Sophia Watson, she still—" "Yes, she still teaches at the conservatory, and she recognized your mother's dress immediately." A melancholic smile appeared on the Major's face. "Mom always said that Madame Sophia was more than a teacher. She was a guide for her musical soul." Arriving at the hotel, the Major insisted on installing himself in a room on another floor to avoid an accidental encounter with Emily before the appropriate time. From the folder he had brought, he carefully removed a yellowed envelope. "These are the last sheet music my mother wrote," he explained, showing Isabella. "Her own compositions that she never got to present publicly. I found them organizing the office after you left." The sheet music, handwritten in an elegant calligraphy, bore personal annotations in the margins. They were more than compositions. They were musical confessions, intimate revelations translated into notes and chords. "I want Emily to have them," he said, his voice laden with contained emotion. "Not just to play, but to understand that our mother was more than an interpreter. She was a creator. She had her own musical voice, just as Emily is discovering hers." The afternoon was advancing, and soon Emily would return from her rehearsal. The Major retired to his room, promising to appear at the right moment. Before leaving, however, he made one last revelation. "I also brought this," he said, removing an old photograph from the folder. In it, a young Helena smiled radiantly next to a piano, her hands resting lovingly on her slightly protruding belly. "It was taken when she was pregnant with me. She used to say I already responded to music even before I was born." Isabella observed the photograph carefully. It was the first time she had seen the Major share something so personal, so vulnerable. The transformation that had begun with Emily's departure for Vienna was gaining new dimensions. "What made you change your mind?" she asked softly. "About coming to Vienna?" The Major was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the photograph of his mother. "I realized I was repeating the cycle," he finally said, letting the fear of the past control the present. "Mom always said that music has the power to heal. Maybe it's time to allow that healing." Emily's performance in the semi-final was received with a standing ovation. Her interpretation of the Moonlight Sonata had touched something deep in the audience, and the judges' comments were unanimous in praising not only her technique, but mainly her ability to convey emotion through music. "It's impressive," commented one of the judges after the announcement of her qualification for the final, "how someone so young can understand so well the emotional layers of this piece." Madame Sophia, who had remained silent during the comments, finally spoke. "She doesn't just understand the music, she lives it, exactly as her grandmother did." Back at the hotel, while celebrating the qualification with a special dinner at the restaurant, Isabella received a discreet message on her cell phone. It was from the Major, confirming his arrival in Vienna the next morning. "Please don't tell Emily yet, I don't want to make her nervous before the final." Isabella smiled to herself, observing Emily who, at that moment, was animatedly describing to Madame Sophia her ideas for the final presentation. Her brother's presence would be a surprise that could change everything. The next morning, while Emily was busy with her final rehearsal at the conservatory, Isabella headed to the airport. The Major, when he finally emerged from the arrival gate, seemed different. His features, although still maintaining their characteristic seriousness, were softer, and he carried with him an old folder that Isabella recognized from the office. "How is she?" was his first question after the formal greetings. "Transformed," responded Isabella honestly. "Vienna has awakened something in her that was dormant, something that goes beyond music." On the way to the hotel, the Major remained silent, his eyes absorbing every detail of the city that had meant so much to his mother. Occasionally his hand caressed the folder he had brought, as if seeking courage in its contents. "We found Madame Sophia," commented Isabella, breaking the silence. "She has been an incredible mentor for Emily." The Major turned abruptly in her direction, surprise evident on his face. "Sophia Watson? She still—" "Yes, she still teaches at the conservatory, and she recognized your mother's dress immediately." A melancholic smile appeared on the Major's face. "Mom always said that Madame Sophia was more than a teacher. She was a guide for her musical soul." Arriving at the hotel, the Major insisted on installing himself in a room on another floor to avoid an accidental encounter with Emily before the appropriate time. From the folder he had brought, he carefully removed a yellowed envelope. "These are the last sheet music my mother wrote," he explained, showing Isabella. "Her own compositions that she never got to present publicly. I found them organizing the office after you left." The sheet music, handwritten in an elegant calligraphy, bore personal annotations in the margins. They were more than compositions. They were musical confessions, intimate revelations translated into notes and chords. "I want Emily to have them," he said, his voice laden with contained emotion. "Not just to play, but to understand that our mother was more than an interpreter. She was a creator. She had her own musical voice, just as Emily is discovering hers." The afternoon was advancing, and soon Emily would return from her rehearsal. The Major retired to his room, promising to appear at the right moment. Before leaving, however, he made one last revelation. "I also brought this," he said, removing an old photograph from the folder. In it, a young Helena smiled radiantly next to a piano, her hands resting lovingly on her slightly protruding belly. "It was taken when she was pregnant with me. She used to say I already responded to music even before I was born." Isabella observed the photograph carefully. It was the first time she had seen the Major share something so personal, so vulnerable. The transformation that had begun with Emily's departure for Vienna was gaining new dimensions. "What made you change your mind?" she asked softly. "About coming to Vienna?" The Major was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the photograph of his mother. "I realized I was repeating the cycle," he finally said, "letting the fear of the past control the present. Mom always said that music has the power to heal. Maybe it's time to allow that healing." When Emily returned to the hotel that afternoon, she was radiant. The final rehearsal had gone perfectly, and Madame Sophia had shared even more stories about her grandmother, including details about her last performance in Vienna. "You won't believe it," she said to Isabella, as she threw herself into an armchair, in the suite. But Grandma used to compose her own pieces. Madame Sophia said she had a whole notebook of compositions that she never showed to anyone except her. Isabella felt her heart accelerate, thinking about the envelope that the Major had brought. "Emily," she began carefully, "there's something I need to tell you." At that moment, a soft knock on the door interrupted her words. It was Mary, the housekeeper, who had insisted on coming to Vienna for the final of the competition. Her face was illuminated by a mysterious smile. "Miss Emily," she said, "there's someone special wanting to see you in the hotel's music room." Emily's heart accelerated. The music room was an elegant space on the mezzanine, rarely used by guests. When the doors opened, the vision that awaited her made her knees weaken. The Major was sitting at the piano, his usually rigid posture slightly softened by the late afternoon light that entered through the tall windows. On the piano was the May folder he had brought from the United States. "Ethan?" whispered Emily, hardly believing her eyes. He stood up slowly, and for the first time in years, Emily saw unshed tears in his eyes. "I couldn't miss your big performance," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Not like Mom missed mine," completed Emily softly, understanding. The hug that followed was different from any other they had shared before. There was none of the Major's usual rigidity, nor Emily's timid hesitation. It was the embrace of two souls finally allowing themselves to feel. When they finally separated, the Major opened the folder he had brought. "I found something I think you should have," he said, carefully removing the well-preserved sheet music. Emily's eyes widened as she recognized the handwriting. "These are Grandma's compositions," she whispered, her fingers trembling as they touched the aged paper. "Madame Sophia just told me about them. She wrote these especially for you," revealed the Major, showing an annotation on the first page. "For my granddaughter, when she is ready to find her own musical voice." Emily sat at the piano, her eyes scanning the notes written with so much love and expectation. She began to play softly, letting her grandmother's music flow through her fingers for the first time. The melody was different from anything she had ever played. It had classical elements, yes, but also a freedom and passion that transcended conventions. It was as if Helena had captured the essence of her deepest feelings and translated them into music. Isabella watched the scene with a full heart. The Major, normally so restrained, had sat beside his sister on the piano bench. His eyes closed as he absorbed each note. Mary, standing near the door, discreetly wiped away tears. "She knew," said Emily softly, when the last note dissipated in the air. "She knew that one day I would be here in Vienna following in her footsteps." "She always knew," responded the Major, his voice carrying an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "And I took too long to accept that this was your destiny too, that trying to protect you from the world meant preventing you from living your own story." Emily rested her head on her brother's shoulder, a gesture of intimacy that would have been unthinkable a few weeks before. "You're here now," she said simply. "That's what matters." The morning of the competition final arrived with a golden clarity typical of the Viennese autumn. In the hotel room, Emily was sitting in front of the mirror while Mary adjusted her hair with the same maternal care as always. Her grandmother's dress, now carrying even more meaning, rested on the bed next to the newly discovered sheet music. "I'm going to play one of her compositions," announced Emily, surprising everyone. In the free part of the program, the Major, who was standing near the window, turned abruptly. "Are you sure? These pieces have never been presented in public." "Exactly why," responded Emily, a new confidence in her voice. "It's time for her, a music to be heard, and what better place than this?" Madame Sophia, who had arrived early to support her new pupil, smiled with approval. Helena would have loved that. She always said her compositions were waiting for the right moment, for the right interpreter. The conservatory was packed for the final. In the program, besides the mandatory piece, a Mozart concerto, each finalist had the freedom to present a composition of their choice. Emily's decision to present an unpublished piece caused a stir among the judges. Backstage, while waiting for her turn, Emily held the sapphire brooch that her brother had sent. The Major, seated in the front row next to Isabella, maintained his military posture, but his eyes revealed contained emotion. When her moment finally arrived, Emily walked to the piano with a serenity that surprised all who knew her. The Mozart concerto was executed with technical precision and sensitivity, but it was the second part of her presentation that made her heart beat faster. Before beginning her grandmother's composition, Emily briefly addressed the audience. This piece is called Prelude for a Reunion. It was composed by my grandmother, Helena Crawford, in this very conservatory many years ago. Today, it finally finds its voice. The first notes filled the air with surprising delicacy. The composition began like a whisper, an intimate dialogue between pianist and instrument. Gradually, the melody developed, growing in complexity and emotion. There were elements of the classical music that Helena loved so much, but also touches of her American roots, subtle rhythms that danced between the more traditional notes. In the middle of the presentation, Emily opened her eyes for a moment and saw something that almost made her lose her place. Her brother was crying. Silent tears ran down the Major's face as he firmly held Isabella's hand. The music reached its climax in an explosion of contained emotion to then softly return to the initial theme, like a circle closing. The last notes were played with so much love and delicacy that they seemed to float in the air even after Emily removed her hands from the piano. The silence that followed was almost sacred, as if the audience needed a moment to process what they had just experienced. Then, like a wave, the applause began. People stood up, some openly crying. Madame Sophia, from her place in the audience, applauded with a radiant smile through her tears. When Emily stood to bow, her eyes met her brother's. In that moment, something fundamental changed between them. They were no longer just siblings united by tragedy and duty. They were heirs to a legacy of love, translated into music. Backstage, after the presentation, the Major found Emily before everyone else. Without saying a word, he enveloped her in an embrace that seemed to want to compensate for years of emotional distance. "She would be so proud," he whispered, his voice breaking, "not just of the music, but of you having had the courage to be true to yourself." Isabella observed the scene with an overflowing heart. That trip to Vienna had transformed into much more than a piano competition. It was a journey of healing, of rediscovery, of rebirth. Mary approached silently with an envelope in her hands. "I found this among the sheet music," she said, handing it to Emily. "I think now is the right time." The envelope that Mary found contained a letter addressed to the Major, written by his mother shortly before the accident. Emily handed it to her brother with trembling hands, instinctively feeling that this moment was crucial. The Major opened the envelope with reverential care, his eyes scanning the words written in that so familiar handwriting. As he read, his posture subtly changed, his shoulders, always so rigid, relaxed, and something in his face softened. "She knew," he finally said, his voice almost a whisper. "She knew I would try to protect Emily from the world, that I would try to control everything after her departure. The letter, she asks me to let the music flow, not to try to contain the river in the name of safety." Isabella and Emily exchanged emotional glances. It was as if Helena, even after so long, still found ways to guide her family. "There's more," continued the Major, turning the page. "She left instructions about her compositions. She wanted them to be published when Emily was ready to interpret them. As if she knew." "She always knew," interrupted Madame Sophia, who had joined the group. "Helena had a special gift, not just for music, but for seeing the potential in people. She saw in Emily, even as a baby, the same flame that she herself carried, the sea." Announcement of the competition results almost seemed secondary, given the emotional intensity of that moment. When Emily was called as the winner, the joy of the conquest mixed with something deeper, the sensation that an important cycle had been completed. On stage, receiving the trophy, Emily gave a speech that touched all those present. "This victory is not just mine. It is a tribute to all the women in my family who kept music alive in their hearts, to my grandmother, Helena, whose compositions finally found their voice, and to my brother, who learned that protecting doesn't always mean Containing, sometimes it means letting fly. That night, the hotel organized a small celebration in the music room. Emily played her grandmother's composition again, but this time with a different lightness, as if an invisible weight had been removed from her shoulders. The Major, observing his sister at the piano, approached Isabella. "Thank you," he said simply, but his eyes said much more. "For what?" she asked softly. "For helping me see beyond the walls I built, for believing there was more to our family than rules and protocols." Isabella smiled, feeling the warmth of his hand seeking hers. It was a small gesture but significant, one more invisible wall beginning to fall. Madame Sophia, who observed everything with her experienced eyes, approached the couple. "You know," she began, her German accent more pronounced by emotion, "Helena always said that music has the power to heal not just the one who plays, but also the one who listens. I see that happening here, with all of you." Emily finished playing and joined them, her eyes shining with joy and accomplishment. The Major embraced her spontaneously, a gesture that now seemed natural, as if it always should have been that way. "When we return to New York," he said, "I want us to transform the music room. No longer a space of rules and rigid schedules, but a place where music can truly live, as Mom always wanted." "And her compositions?" asked Emily anxiously. "We'll publish them as she requested, and you will be the first to officially interpret them. It's time for the world to know not just the interpreter Helena Crawford, but also the composer." The return to New York City was marked by a completely different atmosphere from that which had accompanied the departure. The Major, who before maintained a protocol distance from everyone, now walked beside Emily through the airport, proudly carrying the trophy case, while Isabella followed them with a serene smile. The Crawford mansion, when they finally arrived, seemed different to everyone's eyes. It wasn't the walls or the structure that had changed, but the way they saw it. What before seemed like a fortress of rules and silences now presented itself as a space of possibilities. "The first thing we're going to do," announced the Major, surprising everyone upon entering, "is redecorate the music room. Mary, please bring those old photographs we kept in the attic." Mary, who could barely contain her joy at the transformation of her employer, hurried upstairs. Meanwhile, Emily opened the curtains of the music room, letting the natural light flood the environment. The piano, silent witness to so many changes, shone under the afternoon sun. "I found this in Vienna," said Isabella, removing a small framed picture from her bag. It was a photograph of the conservatory, dated from the time when Helena studied there. "Madame Sophia gave it to me before we left. She said it would be perfect for the new decoration." The Major took the picture carefully, his eyes fixed on the image. "Right here," he decided, pointing to a space on the wall next to the piano, "where everyone can see where we came from and where we can go." Mary returned with several boxes, and together they began to discover long-forgotten treasures. Photographs of Helena in various recitals, recital programs yellowed by time, even an old wooden metronome that she used in her lessons. "Look at this," exclaimed Emily, removing a worn leather notebook from one of the boxes. "These are her lesson notes, exercises, techniques, observations about different composers." The Major sat beside his sister on the sofa, something he would never have done a few weeks before, and together they began to leaf through the notebook. Each page revealed more about the extraordinary woman who had shaped their lives, even in her absence. "There's a part here about how she developed her own compositions," noted Emily, her eyes shining with excitement. "She mixed classical techniques with American rhythms, exactly as I felt when I played her music in Vienna." Isabella observed the scene with a full heart. The Major's transformation was evident not only in his actions, but in his very body posture. The military rigidity was still present. It was part of who he was, but now there was a softness in his gestures, an openness in his expression that made his presence welcoming instead of intimidating. "You know," he said, standing up to examine the piano, "when I was a child, she used to play for me every night before I went to sleep, not just the classical pieces she studied, but her own compositions. She said each child deserved their own lullaby." "Do you remember any of them?" asked Emily softly. The Major closed his eyes for a moment as if seeking a distant memory. Then, to everyone's surprise, he sat at the piano. His fingers, though not as agile as Emily's or Helena's, found the notes with surprising precision. It was a simple, sweet melody, with a touch of melancholy that made it deeply moving. Emily soon recognized elements that she would later see developed in her grandmother's more complex compositions. "She never wrote this one down," said the Major, his hands still on the keys. "It was our special music, just hers and mine. I think it's time to share it, isn't it?" Emily nodded, already positioning herself beside her brother on the piano bench. Together, they began to explore the melody, Emily adding harmonies that perfectly complemented the original melodic line. Isabella and Mary watched the scene with tears in their eyes. It was as if Helena's spirit was present in the room, smiling to see her children finally finding the harmony that she had always known was possible. The news of Emily's victory in Needijk, the international competition, and the discovery of Helena Crawford's unpublished compositions quickly spread through the musical circle of New York City. Invitations for performances began to arrive, and the young pianist found herself at the center of growing attention from the specialized media. The Major, who before would have protected his sister from all this exposure, now demonstrated a surprising balance between support and protection. Together with Isabella, he helped Emily carefully select commitments, always prioritizing those that would allow Helena's musical legacy to be presented with the respect it deserved. "I received an interesting invitation," announced Emily during breakfast, a few weeks after their return. "Carnegie Hall wants to organize a special concert, not only with Grandma's compositions, but also—" She hesitated, looking shyly at her brother, "with that lullaby you showed me." The Major, who was reading the newspaper, lowered it slowly. "Our music?" he asked, his voice soft. "Yes, I've been working on it, developing it. I transformed it into a complete piece, maintaining the original essence, but adding elements that represent our journey, our transformation." Isabella, who had become a fundamental part of this new family dynamic, observed the exchange between the siblings with attention. The Major remained silent for a moment, his face revealing an internal struggle between the past and the present. "Do you think she would approve?" he finally asked, referring to his mother. "I think she would be radiant," responded Emily with conviction. Music was always her way of uniting people, of expressing what words couldn't say. The Major stood up and walked to the window of the dining room, which now remained always open, letting in light and the sounds of the garden. "You know," he said, "I spent so much time trying to protect her memories, keeping them as precious secrets, that I almost forgot the most important thing. Memories, like music, need to be shared to truly live." The preparation for the concert transformed the Crawford mansion once more. The music room became the heart of the house, with Emily spending hours at the piano, working on Helena's compositions and on her own version of the lullaby. The Major frequently joined her after returning from the barracks, sometimes just to listen, other times sharing memories that the music awakened. Isabella, observing this transformation, began to notice subtle changes in her own relationship with the Major. The initial rigidity had given way to a silent complicity, a mutual understanding that grew each day. On the nights when Emily practiced until late, they developed the habit of having tea together on the veranda, talking about music, memories, and dreams for the future. One afternoon, while organizing the concert programs, the Major found an old photo of their wedding. In it, he and Isabella were side by side, both with solemn and distant expressions. "It seems like another life," he commented, showing the photo to Isabella. "It was another life," she responded softly. "We were different people. People who didn't know how to love," he completed, his eyes meeting hers with a new intensity, "who confused control with protection, duty with dedication." "And now?" she asked, her heart accelerating slightly. "Now," he said, taking her hand with a delicacy that would have seemed impossible before, "I think we're finally learning the true music of love, the one my mother tried to teach us through her compositions." From the piano, the notes of the lullaby, now transformed by Emily into a complex and emotional piece, flowed softly. It was as if Helena was there, blessing not only the transformation of her family, but also the new beginning that was taking shape for everyone. Carnegie Hall was completely packed on the night of the concert. Backstage, Emily adjusted the midnight blue dress of her grandmother, now carrying even more stories and meanings. The sapphire brooch shone softly under the lights, and the pearls in her ears seemed to capture all the nervousness and expectation of the moment. Madame Sophia just arrived, announced Isabella, entering the dressing room. The Viennese teacher had made a point of coming to the United States especially for this concert, bringing with her more of Helena's sheet music and notes that she had found in her personal archives. "How is Ethan?" asked Emily, while Mary gave the final touches to her hairdo. "Nervous," responded Isabella with a soft smile, though he's trying not to show it. He's checking the arrangement of the photographs in the foyer for the third time. The Major had insisted on mounting a small exhibition with photos and documents of Helena, transforming the concert into a true celebration of her legacy. The walls of the foyer now told the story of an extraordinary woman who had left her mark not only through music, but through the love she inspired in all who knew her. When Emily finally ascended the stage, the hall plunged into a reverent silence. The program would begin with Helena's unpublished compositions, presented for the first time to the public. Each piece had been carefully selected to tell a story, the story of a family, of a love that transcended time, of wounds that were finally beginning to heal. In the front row, the Major firmly held Isabella's hand. His eyes, normally so controlled, shone with contained emotion as he observed his sister giving life to his mother's compositions. Beside him, Madame Sophia occasionally wiped away a discreet tear, recognizing in the music the echoes of conversations she had had with Helena so many years before. The second part of the concert was dedicated to the expanded version of the lullaby. When Emily announced the piece explaining its origin and significance, the Major felt his heart tighten. The first notes were exactly as he remembered, the simple and sweet melody that his mother played every night. But then, gradually, the music began to transform. Emily had interwoven the original melody with elements of Helena's compositions and her own contributions. It was as if 3 generations of musicians were conversing through the notes, each adding their own voice to the family story. At a certain point, the music took on darker tones, representing the years of pain and distance. But then, like a ray of sunlight through heavy clouds, the original melody emerged again, now richer, deeper, carrying with it all the experiences and transformations. Isabella felt the Major's hand squeeze hers more tightly. Turning to look at him, she saw something she had never seen before, tears flowing freely down his face. They weren't tears of sadness, but of liberation, as if each note played by Emily was undoing one more knot in his heart. The end of the piece brought back the original theme of the lullaby, but now transformed into something greater, more luminous. The last note sounded like a promise of new beginnings, of rediscovered love, of family, reunited. When the final silence established itself, before the applause even began, the Major stood up. In a gesture that surprised everyone, including himself, he walked to the stage and climbed the steps to embrace his sister. There, before all of New York society, Major Ethan Crawford, known for his rigidity and self-control, allowed himself to be simply a proud brother, a longing son, a man capable of demonstrating love. In the week following the concert, the Crawford mansion breathed a completely new atmosphere. The permanently open windows let in not only sunlight but also the sounds of life that now pulsed in every room. From the piano, melodies constantly came, sometimes Emily practicing, other times the Major relearning old songs. The music room had transformed into the heart of the house. The walls, previously austere, now told the family's story through carefully arranged photographs. The portrait of Helena at the piano occupied a place of prominence, her radiant smile seeming to bless the changes that had occurred. On a particularly significant afternoon, the Major gathered Emily and Isabella in his office, that same space that had once been his isolated refuge. The door, which once remained always locked, now was constantly open. "I found this," he said, removing a yellowed envelope from a drawer. "It's the contract of our marriage, Isabella." She took the document carefully, recalling that day that seemed to have happened in another life. The signatures on the paper were mere symbols of an agreement between families, without any trace of the love that now existed. "I thought we could do something different," he continued, surprising her by tearing the contract into pieces. "I no longer want a marriage based on duties and obligations. I want a love that dances freely, like the music my mother always tried to teach us." Emily observed the scene with tears in her eyes, recognizing how much her brother had changed. The rigid and controlling man had given way to someone capable of vulnerability, of demonstrating affection, of risking himself emotionally. "And there's more," he added, turning to Emily. "Madame Sophia wrote to me. She wants you to go study in Vienna next semester, not as an obligation but as a choice. Your choice." Emily's face lit up, but there was a question in her eyes. "And you?" "Me?" The Major smiled, a genuine smile that now appeared with increasing frequency. "I'll learn to trust, to let you fly with your own wings, knowing that our love, like music, knows no distance." That night, the family gathered in the music room, Emily at the piano playing a new composition she was developing, the Major and Isabella sitting close, their hands intertwined naturally. Mary, who had become much more than a housekeeper, observed the scene with a full heart. "You know," said Emily, pausing in the music, "I think I finally understood what Grandma meant in her last letter, about how music has the power to heal, to transform, to unite. And about how true love is like a beautiful melody," completed the Major, looking tenderly at Isabella. "It needs time to develop, space to breathe, freedom to flow." Isabella squeezed his hand gently, recognizing how much they had grown together. The marriage that had begun as a cold contract had transformed into a dance of souls, a harmonious duet of hearts that had learned to beat to the same rhythm. The piano sounded again, under Emily's fingers, filling the house with notes that spoke of love, of forgiveness, of new beginnings. On the wall, Helena's portrait seemed to smile with even more affection, as if she knew that her most important legacy wasn't just her compositions, but the love she had planted, and that was finally flowering in her family. And so, the Crawford mansion,